The Skinwalker's house. I want to share this story because someone might find it useful, but I share this information urging you to be extremely careful, and I beg you to never use it unless you find that you must. During my freshman year of college, I lost control, mostly due to freedom from my parents and a group of friends who were more interested in a good party than a good grade. I spent more time sleeping and drinking than I did in class or studying. But all of that changed when I woke up in the hospital bruised and covered in cuts. I was told I had been in a car accident the night before. I and two others were driving home from a party when the car crossed into the center divider, rolling several times and tossing all of us from the car. Miraculously, I escaped the crash with some scrapes and bruises, but mostly unharmed. The other guy in the car, Michael, broke his arm and got a bad concussion. However, the third occupant, a girl named Sam, was tossed in front of the rolling car and crushed underneath it. It took a rescue crew 4 hours to extricate her from underneath the crumpled mess of metal, and by the time they got to her, she was beyond saving. The police had no idea who was driving during the crash, and I couldn't remember anything about that night due to my state of impairment. Michael and I got stiff warnings about driving while intoxicated or getting into a car with a drunk person, but other than that we got off scot-free. My friends all said that Sam had been driving, and that I was so fucked up I couldn't even walk, let alone drive a car. Despite their reassurances, I was haunted by guilt and uncertainty. Had I been driving when we wrecked? Why did I survive? Was I responsible for her death? Every night I had nightmares of Sam calling for me from underneath her twisted metallic grave. I stopped leaving my dorm, stopped answering my phone, consumed by guilt and uncertainty. After a month of moping around my dorm, a friend of mine named Mark reached out. We talked for hours about my uncertainty and how I would never get answers. In response, he told me about the legend of the Skinwalker's house, a ramshackle green shack right off of Highway 380. Here a person could meet with the ancient beings and make deals and bargain, including asking questions that otherwise could not be answered. At first, I was incredulous. I thought Mark was fucking with me, trying to play a sick prank. But I was desperate to know, so I talked to some friends who had grown up on a nearby reservation. One of them put me in touch with a tribal elder named Richard, and after a few emails and lying about doing a research project, Richard told me about summoning a skinwalker, which the Navajo call naaldlooshii. When we first spoke, Richard was hesitant to talk about the subject. But after repeated calls and a face-to-face meeting, Richard explained the ritual to summon a skinwalker. As we finished our conversation, Richard warned me that when one makes a bargain with a witch, the witch always takes something in return. I will give you the same warning that Richard gave me. Naaldlooshii is not to be summoned or questioned on a whim. Please do not summon a skinwalker unless you are ready to accept the consequences of your actions. If you decide to disregard my warning, you will need the pelt of a coyote, 4 animal fat candles, a rosary that has been blessed by a priest, a liter of animal blood, and a crow's feather. Skinwalkers are most active right after sundown when there is a storm coming in from the southeast. The house where you can meet them is between mile marker 13 and 14. It's not hard to find. It took 3 months to find everything, and for the perfect weather system to arrive. Mark and I drove together to the house around 5, just as the sun began to sink underneath the Magdalenas. Shadows oozed from the dilapidated house, its putrid green paint peeling off of the bleached bones of wood. The house had no windows or doors remaining, and I could smell the mildew and rot from the road. Mark and I climbed through the barbed wire fence in front of the house, and made our way in as storm clouds rolled in, bringing with them peals of angry thunder. As we stepped inside, the smell of old rotting wood overwhelmed me, and I fought the urge to vomit as we sat down on the stripped wooden floor. We spread out the coyote pelt with the head facing me, placing the greasy wax candles at the ends of its paws. We then placed the crow's feather in the mouth of the coyote pelt. After setting up the pelt and lighting the candles, Mark left the house and parked the car at a turn off a mile up the road. When I was sure he was gone, I took the rosary in my hands and pulled hard, scattering the beads across the floor and pelt. I sat down at the head and took the goat's blood I had procured from a butcher and dumped it across the pelt, spattering myself in the ground in dark maroon splatters. The storm continued its steady progression across the desert, and the roar of thunder rumbled in my chest. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound of the storm willing the creature towards me. I was lost deep in my focus when I heard it, a wolf's howl mixed with the screams of a woman, a horrible cacophony of animal and man swirling together. I opened my eyes, to see the house wreathed in fog, the supernatural mist surrounding the house, but not permeating the structure itself. I heard a deep guttural chant coming from behind me as the creature approached the dilapidated wooden structure. Then came the footsteps, heavy padding steps crunched against the gravel behind me, quickly followed by the creak of wood as it stepped into the house. Its hot breath stung at the back of my neck as it sniffed me, before circling in front of me. It had taken the form of a huge gray wolf, far bigger than even myself. The legs were too long and spindly, the hide patchy and balding, and its ears were short and tattered. The Skinwalker sat across the pelt from me and stared at me, staring at me like I was a rabbit about to be devoured. Its eyes were unlike those of a wolf's, with dark brown iris, angry white sclera, and round pupils. Suddenly the wolf let out a pained yelp and began to shudder. The braying whimpers of the animal filled the house, as the fur and skin began to slough off the creature. The flesh sizzled and popped like frying meat as the body began to disintegrate, quickly followed by the opening of the chest cavity as a woman crawled out of the quickly decomposing wolf carcass. She had Native American features with skin so wrinkled and scarred I couldn't even guess her age. Hair hung in black stringy strands, and worst of all, her lips were stretched and mangled, so that her mouth could never close fully. She wore a patchwork of skins, and pelts and a pair of antlers atop her head. Even sitting she was nearly a head taller than me. She locked eyes with me, inhuman horizontal slits like a goat's peering out from behind the mess of hair that hung around her face. Her voice croaked in her throat, and a harsh guttural dialect spewed forth from her lips. My heart sank. How could I have been so stupid? Why would an ancient Navajo witch speak English? She must have noticed my disappointment because she reached for a pouch on her belt and took out some sort of gray waxy substance. She spread it on the tips of her index fingers, leaned forward and jammed her fingers into my ears, her long dirty fingernails scratching my ear canal. I yelled in pain and surprise at the intrusion and she shifted her weight back into a sitting position. For a split second my hearing faded before the sound of the storm surged back to life with a loud crack. The old woman locked eyes with me again, her face lit by the flickering candlelight. She spoke again, this time in English. I have given you the gift of hearing. What is it you seek from I who goes on all fours? Her voice low and raspy, like sandpaper on stone. My voice caught in my throat, my gut tightening at her words as I began to drift into a daze. I pushed my fingernails into the flesh of my palm until I could focus again. When I did answer, my voice was weak and uncertain. I need to know if I killed her. She cackled, her voice spiraling to a crescendo until she sounded like a coyote baying at a frightened rabbit. Very well, Bilagana, I can help you. But what have you brought for me? My stomach twisted painfully again as fear clawed at the back of my mind. I haven't brought anything to give you. Very well, if you have nothing to give, then I must take. Do you agree to these terms? I paused for a moment considering what Richard had told me, but my guilt overwhelmed my rationale, and I shakily nodded my head in agreement at her terms. The Skinwalker smiled at this, revealing rows of miscellaneous teeth in her cavernous, distorted mouth. The teeth were inhuman, with sharp wolf-like canines mixed in with broad flat teeth like a horse, in a horrible conglomeration of stained rows of ivory shards. The laughter came again from her lips, horrible coyote cackling that made my skin crawl. After another round of laughter, she produced a crude stone knife from her belt, and with a quick motion ran it across the palm of her hand, spilling dark rivulets of blood onto the pelt before reaching towards me. I extended my hand, and she dug the cruel stone into the soft flesh of my palm. My skin cried out in agony, and blood wept from the exposed flesh underneath. She clasped my bleeding hand with inhuman strength and pressed my wound against her own. Our blood mixed, and I felt it trickle down my arm and pool at the crook of my elbow. The woman began to chant and stared into my eyes as blood continued to flow freely down our arms onto the pelt beneath us. Her voice grew rough and animalistic as she continued her chanting. As suddenly as she had started, she stopped and let go of my now throbbing hand. Oh Bilagana, how foolish you have been. Just like your forefathers, with their drink and their endless cruelty. But her blood is on her own hands. Her foolish pride gave way to steel and glass. I have given you your answer, and now I will take two things from you. I take from you naaldlooshii, your dreams. A wave of relief washed over me. I could live without dreams anymore. My dreams had been plagued with visions of Sam calling out for help from beneath her metallic tomb, begging for my help. With inhuman strength and speed, the Skinwalker grabbed my hand again and brought it to its mouth. I pulled hard against its grip and yelled to no avail as it pushed my thumb into its mouth. Hard teeth clamped down hard against the appendage, tearing away the flesh and bone of my thumb. Blood sprayed from the wound, painting a sanguine picture on its face. The creature chewed, and I could hear the crack of bone and the squelch of soft flesh in its teeth. I screamed in agony, clutching my hand and pressing the wound to my chest. My vision faded and blurred as I slumped to the floor. I wish I had gone unconscious. I wish I had closed my eyes. Instead, I watched as the Skinwalker tore at the flesh of its face, its long claw-like fingernails shredding through skin and muscle. The Skinwalker grabbed the skin on its arm and pulled, tearing it away from the muscle underneath, the flesh coming away like wet newspaper. I watched the muscles of its arm bulge and flex as it tore away the soft skin of its stomach, disemboweling itself. The gray coil of intestines lolled out of the abomination's abdomen, dragging against the rough wooden floor. It continued tearing away its flesh until only scraps remained on a skeletal frame. I willed my eyes to close, but they would not. I stared transfixed on the horrifying visage in front of me. The figure dropped to all fours and pulled one of the pelts it was wearing over its face. The pelt stretched and contorted, spreading over the skeletal limbs. The figure trembled and shook, twitching unnaturally, then it began to grow, the limbs stretching and contorting, the chest becoming narrower. I watched as two sets of large antlers splintered out of the top of its head, stopping just before the ceiling. The figure continued to shift and contort until finally, a massive bull elk stood in front of me. It strode out of the house, then paused and looked down at me. We locked eyes for just a moment before it let out a loud bugle and took off into the night. I pulled off my shirt and wrapped it tightly around my still bleeding hand. I staggered out of the house and glanced around, afraid the creature was waiting for me outside. There was nothing, except for the rumble of thunder and the throbbing in my hand. I walked a mile to where Mark had parked the car, all the time pleading with my body to not bleed out. Mark paled when he saw me and rushed me to the hospital. I told the staff at the hospital that I had been messing with old farm equipment, a story they bought easily enough. In spite of everything that happened, I felt relieved with the knowledge that I hadn't killed Sam. The Skinwalker kept its word. It did take my dreams, because now I dream not about Sam, but instead about the Skinwalker. I dream of the Skinwalker changing and shifting. I watch time and time again as it tears apart animals for its dinner. The worst is when it attacks people, as I am forced to watch as it stalks hikers and campers. I watch as it disembowels them, mounts their bodies onto tree limbs or skins them alive. I don't go into the woods anymore for fear that I may see that thing again. But now and then as I drift off to sleep, I hear the sound of an elk bugle, followed by peals of coyote cackling. My childhood dog ran into the woods. When he returned, there was something very wrong with him. I vividly remember the day Duke disappeared. My family was spending the day at the lake next to our little bungalow, at a quaint property in northern Ontario. All four of us were swimming and splashing around in the warm lake water, attempting to quell the blistering August heat. Our only neighbor for miles, an old retired police officer named Benny, was smoking on his patio. I waved to him and he waved back. We were in the dog days of summer, and I was glad to be in the water. Duke loved the water as much as I did and was still very energetic, being a large, middle-aged mutt. We would often throw frisbees and sticks off the dock, where he would take flying leaps into the blue-green lake. That's exactly what we were doing when he vanished. As I was drawing back my hand to throw the frisbee for Duke, who was anticipating a throw and getting ready to run, he suddenly whipped his head to the woods. I too looked back at the rows of towering hardwoods and conifers, scanning them to see what Duke was looking at. It was nothing. At least, to me. What followed was a blur. Duke suddenly bolted for the trees, barking and snarling all while we were screaming his name. I screamed at my parents to get out of the water and help me chase him. I even saw Benny spring out of his rocking chair to help us. I ran as fast as my 9-year-old legs could carry me into the dense forest, twigs and debris snapping under my feet. But you can only get so far in flip-flops before you trip. I tumbled to the ground screaming and crying after accidentally scraping my leg against a sharp rock. My mom consoled me, while I caught a glimpse of my dad running through the woods. It was a while before my dad and Benny came back. My dad had a somber look on his face. He didn't have to tell us what we already knew. But Benny looked shaken. I'm sorry folks, but he isn't coming back, he said shakily. He took off his faded baseball cap respectfully and patted me on the shoulder before trudging up the hill back to his house. My whole family missed him, but to me, it felt like a part of me left when Duke did. He had been my best friend since I was young, and I even had a small photo album packed with pictures of the two of us. For a while, every night before bed I would sift through the laminated pages of the photo album, reminiscing about good times, and praying that someday he would come back to us. Deep down, I knew he wouldn't. A few months after Duke disappeared, my dad arrived home from work with a surprise. It was another dog. It wasn't elegant and athletic like Duke was. It was one of those tiny, white yappy ones with crusty red goop around its eyes. My parents fell in love with it. Princess, they called her. But I didn't. I simply referred to her as the dog. I was bitter, so bitter because I'd interpreted my dad's gesture of kindness as his own confirmation of Duke's absence. In time, I did grow to tolerate her. I had to admit, she was good company and it was cute when she curled up by my feet. Life was going normally for us until Duke came back. It had almost been a year since Duke had disappeared. On this particular day, we were all cooped up inside, courtesy of the rain. I was engulfed in my book when suddenly, I heard a bark. Not a high-pitched yap, but a deep, booming bark. I put down my book and rushed to the back door where I had heard it, Princess cuddling at my heels. When I peeked through the window, I nearly fell over. It was Duke. Somehow. By this time, my parents had arrived. My mom rushed past me and whirled the door open, while my dad and I hung back, mouths agape. As my mom hugged Duke, I couldn't help but notice something off. I'd spent countless hours spending time with him, and sleepless nights poring over photo albums. I'd familiarized myself with every spot, marking and quirk of Duke's fur. One of his most striking features was a black spot over his left eye, which had appeared in almost every one of the photos. But standing here was Duke. His eye spot was now on his right eye. As a matter of fact, his whole pelt seemed to have been flipped. He was missing his collar, and he was skinnier than we'd last seen him, but it was him alright. Well, that's what I'd thought. The first red flag was how Princess reacted to Duke. She was a yappy dog alright, but when she saw Duke, she went ballistic. Spitting and yapping like we'd never seen before. Princess barks at everything, remember, my dad told me, sensing my discomfort. She's probably just barking, because he smells like the forest. And with that, he went outside to greet Duke. The barking must have alerted Benny, and he went outside to see what the commotion was. Once he saw what was going on, he darted back into his house and audibly slammed the door. When my parents came back inside, I tentatively stuck out a hand for Duke to sniff. He didn't wag his tail like I expected him to, all he did was quietly sit down. Then, he heard Princess yapping from the other side of the room. His head swiveled, and he lifted himself, and padded confidently towards her. Before long, he had her cornered. All he was doing was standing and watching her, yet Princess's eyes were bulging as she howled and yapped. A sense of dread was beginning to creep up my spine. But before anything happened, my dad whistled, and Duke lifted his head. With one last glance at Princess, he slunk away. The sense of wrongness didn't alleviate for the rest of the time Duke was with us. The second red flag was that Duke didn't eat the food we put out for him. Granted, it was food intended for small dogs, but it was still the same formula. Dogs are wired to eat everything they can get their paws on anyways, so even then it wouldn't have mattered. Not once did I see him eat. Every time we let him outside in the woods to relieve himself, he came back 20 minutes later, his white muzzle stained pink. I found it odd that my parents didn't think he was at risk of running away again, but since he didn't run, I never brought it up. They spent all their time with Duke. Petting him, coddling him, attempting to feed him, and playing with him. All this while completely ignoring Princess, as well as my objections. Something's different about him, I'd brought up during dinner one day. That's nonsense. What are you talking about, said my dad. He's good old Duke. He looked at the dog, as if searching for approval. We ate the rest of dinner in silence. As the summer went on, Duke seemed to gain more and more influence over my family. At this point, it was just me taking care of Princess. It was up to me to feed, walk and take care of her now, as my parents had completely neglected her. This dog wasn't the Duke I used to know. Every time he walked into the same room that Princess was in, she would scuttle away in fear and into my arms. I took to always being in the same room as Princess, just as a precaution. From what, I didn't want to admit. But deep down, I think I knew. One day, Benny approached me while I was walking Princess. "You doing okay, kid?" Yeah, it's I trailed off. Benny bent down to meet my height, his friendly blue eyes clouded with concern. "Be careful, kid. If you need any help, I'm right up here." Without another word, he turned and walked back into his house. When I came back from the walk, my mom announced that we were going to the store. Dad had figured out that Duke liked raw meat, and we had run out of it. As a matter of fact, we had run out of all other food in the house. But of course, in order to enter the grocery store, we needed to leave the dogs alone. I wanted to stay home and look after Princess, but my mom wasn't having it. "I don't know why you always insist on being around that dog," said my mom. "It's not healthy." "Look who's talking," I muttered. "We're going to buy a bunch of raw meat for a dumb dog." For that, she slapped me. Tears sprung from my eyes. "Don't you dare speak about Duke that way," she huffed. "Get in the car." Without another word, I did as she said and got in, leaving Princess behind with the dog. I couldn't stop thinking about Princess as my parents cleared out the raw meat section. The drive home was nerve-wracking, and the walk up the driveway to our cottage was dreadful. I could hear the whimpering even before the door was open. Hard in my throat, I whirled the door open and screamed. Princess was under the kitchen table, leg bleeding profusely. No, it was gone. One of her legs was just gone. Curled up on the carpet was Duke, muzzle stained red. The rest of my family walked in. "Oh, the mess you've made. Bad dog," my mom said as she scolded Princess. She gave a pathetic whimper in response. This was my breaking point. "Stop," I wailed. "Are you guys blind? He tried to kill her. She needs to go to the vet." Yeah. "Duke, I have a snack for you." His ears shot up as my dad ripped open a package of ground beef. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten all day, and the only food we'd bought was meat for Duke. I was livid. This damn dog was taking them over. I didn't feel safe anymore. "I'm leaving," I announced. "I'm taking Princess with me." Tears were streaming down my face, even as no one acknowledged me. I packed a few belongings and grabbed a towel to wrap Princess in. I remembered what Benny had said to me earlier that day, and I knew what I had to do. As I trudged down the dirt trail to Benny's house, thoughts collided into each other in my mind. Why were my parents ignoring me so much? Why didn't they care about Princess? Did they even love me anymore? The last one made me cry even harder. I reached the faded red door of Benny's house and knocked. He appeared a moment later, and when he saw me holding Princess with tears streaming down my face, his breath hitched. "I knew this would happen," he muttered gravely under his breath. "Get in my truck, kid. We'll go get your dog some help." He unlocked his truck and without another word, and I climbed silently into the backseat. I watched the cloud-dotted sky turn into pale shades of pink and purple as we sped down the bumpy road. After a while, we arrived at a small house which seemed to have been converted into a veterinarian clinic. Benny took Princess in his arms and rushed in, yelling for help. I followed along slowly and sat down in the waiting room, sad and defeated, but too tired to cry even more. After a lot of frantic pleading, Princess was to receive emergency care. A woman in a teal veterinarian's uniform carried her away. I sprung out of my seat. "Let me go with her," I begged. Benny guided me away. "She's gonna get help now, kid. It's in God's hands now." I plopped back down and curled into a ball. Benny patted me on the back. A somber silence had appeared between us when I broke it by asking Benny something that I hadn't gotten the chance to before. Benny, what did you mean when you said that you knew this would happen? He tensed up, a guarded look crossed his face, then one of guilt. He exhaled a melancholy sigh. Well, you see kid, you know why I live alone? He asked. I shook my head. Well, I had family too once. Marjorie. And my son, James. A sad look crossed his face. You remind me of him. We had a dog too. A beautiful pointer, named Max. James loved him. So, he was all torn up when he went running away. But one day, about a year later, we find him standing at the front door. Something's wrong in those woods. It changed Max. He wouldn't eat the dog food we got him, only raw meat. James was happy to see him, but Marge was happier. I found it strange, because the night I'd brought Max home from the pound, she yelled at me like she never had before. Benny chuckled wistfully to himself. Well, since I was busy patrolling all day and night, I didn't notice it as much as I should have. James kept missing school, and I noticed he was thinner. I told Marge that she had to take care of her son. But all she did all day was spend time with the dog. I tried to do the best I could, but I was a terrible dad and a terrible husband. I should have helped my wife. I should have protected James. He exhaled. I'm sorry, I said quietly, not knowing what else to say. Benny shook his head. I aren't finished yet. You see, one day, me and my partner get a call. Some neighbors had called about a disturbance at my address. My partner was in the driver's seat, and I was the first one to get out of the car. When I walked in the house, I saw my boy in the middle of the kitchen. Dead. The dog was eating him. Instinctively, I shot the dog. That's when Marge turned around with a knife. She lunged at me and I shot the fatal blow. All 3 members of my family, dead in one night. My mouth was wide, and the full weight of his words weighed heavy on me. Was that to be the future of my family? Benny, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. I looked up at him to see a single tear trickling down on his otherwise stony expression. I failed James as a father. I can't do the same with you, kiddo. After his story was finished, I felt my eyelids start to droop. I leaned on Benny's arm. Good night, Benny. He was staring straight ahead, face emotionless. Good night. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was how much my back hurt from sleeping on a chair all night. But I wasn't cold. Benny had put his tattered flannel jacket over me as a blanket. I sprung up from my chair and yelped at the receptionist. Where's Benny? She jumped in shock. He went to go do some errands. He said. She got up from her chair and picked up a few items. Take this, dearie, you must be starving. She placed a buttered bagel, a blueberry muffin, a banana and a bottle of apple juice on the table next to me. She was right, I was starving. Food always tastes the best after you've been deprived of it. I ran my fingers over my ribs. I could feel each one protruding from my chest. This was the first time I'd been full in ages. The receptionist had informed me that Princess had made it and that she was in the recovery stage. When I saw her for the first time, my heart exploded out of love for Princess, and I hugged her gently. I smiled as she licked my face. I didn't know where else to go, so I played Scrabble with the receptionist for the rest of the day. I got to meet a fat cat named Mr. Cuddles, a rabbit named Twix, and I got to eat a hamburger for lunch. But all throughout the day, I kept wondering, when would Benny be back? At 3:04 p.m., my question was answered as Benny stumbled through the door. There was blood on his clothes. A couple of police cars were waiting outside. Let's get going, kid. Although I didn't get the full story immediately, I came to know the full extent of what had happened eventually. Even though he wasn't part of the police force anymore, Benny still had connections with the department and to the people that know what happened to his family. They gathered police officers and went to my house, where they found Duke eating the carcasses of my parents. Benny shot him dead. I wept profusely for my parents, not for how they were to me in their final weeks, but for the people they once were. Benny assured me that they had loved me. There were not many people at the funeral, mostly townsfolk. Seeing as I didn't have any other relatives, the courts placed me in the custody of Benny after a lengthy court process. A few years later, he officially adopted me. Princess came to live with us too. Benny was proud of me. when I went off to police college, when I got married, when my wife and I had a child. As per his wishes, we held him a small funeral. Life is generally good to me. I have a wonderful wife and an amazing daughter. Sometimes on the bad days in the dead of night, I thrash in my sleep as visions of dead dogs and screaming people writhe in my nightmares. But when I wake, I look at my daughter sleeping in her cradle, and my wife hugs me back to sleep. I remember that everything is okay now,